So why are there videos included in this project? Well, I'll explain. Okay, so this project is supposed to be about finding a culture, right, that's different from, quote, our culture in Portland, friends and family and all of that, and doing some research about it, right? Yes. So Rory has picked deaf culture, specifically deaf culture in the United States, which needs a little bit of explanation because most people know nothing about deaf culture. So let me do this. A few things. We're going to describe pieces about George Veditz later, but film is very, very important and valued in deaf culture because it shows the language. If we back up, maybe you know someone who struggles with hearing. Maybe you know someone who wears hearing aids or has a cochlear implant. Maybe they use a different amplification and they talk, but they don't really sign. That person can, yes, be hard of hearing. Maybe they're legally deaf, but they're not culturally deaf. Most of that world signs. That's the connection. They use ASL. So video needs to be included in this piece because it describes the culture, because you need to show the language itself and how it functions. That's the part that is important in the deaf world. And hearing culture and deaf culture are very, very different. Little explanations I'll give you, but it can be really important. Those who use ASL really, really value its use. It's incredibly emphasized. So maybe the people watching this don't sign. Maybe they've never met someone who's deaf. That's fine. That's okay. Because if they aren't children who are hearing and grew up with deaf parents, codas, there's not really a way for them to be included in that up until now. However, because the language itself is such a big part of the community and the culture, it means that codas, have an inclusion in the deaf community and in deaf culture. Interpreters, some people who grow up signing because you know what the deaf world looks like. And yes, there are some interpreters who are part of the deaf community and deaf culture. They don't tend to be deaf, obviously, although there are some deaf interpreters. But why would there be deaf interpreters? Because there are different signed languages. So we'll go into that as well. Thank you. Enjoy it. So first, we're going to talk about the timeline right down here, because it provides context for you to be able to understand all the different pieces here on the board. Okay, so long time ago, Greek period, they had really looked down on deaf people. They decided that they couldn't learn, and they labeled them as unable to progress. And then the Catholic Church decided that deafness was caused by sin. After that, in the year 1620, there was the first book that included illustrations of a manual alphabet. And that disseminated, but it took until the 1760s-ish, which is, just right before the United States Revolution happened, was the first time that there was a public school for deaf students. It was established in Paris, France, by a man, Abbé Lepay. That's his side name. Okay. So he had noticed that you can teach deaf students. You can teach them to read, you can teach them to write, and it's in French, yes, but they sign LSF, which means that school, the teachers would show up and talk? No, they showed up and they signed. And students would watch and they would learn in their native language. A few years later, Lepay publishes the first signed dictionary. Okay? Well, there's a very famous story in deaf culture that comes after this. So there's a man named Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. That's his sign name right here. And he's out walking one day, and he sees a little girl just kind of playing by herself. And He's like, oh, that's my friend's kid. I know her. I know her. So he comes up and he talks and tries to call her name. And she just keeps playing. And he's like, hey, no, I'm talking. Hi. Calls her name again. Gets a little louder. Nothing. So he walks up and taps her on the shoulder. And she panics a little bit. And she's scared. Recognizes him. It's fine. Okay. Waves hi. And he's like, oh, that's right. She's deaf. So later he's talking with this girl's dad. And he's like, what are you going to do? Like, she was playing all by herself. What's happening? And dad says, well, like, we can't find anybody to teach her because no one knows how. Like, we don't know how to improve her reading or her writing. We don't need to get her any information. And it's like, there's some places in Europe that they have options. Like, did you want to try and see if we could do that here? Like, send someone to go learn how to teach deaf people? Yeah, that would be great. So Gallaudet decides, fine, he's going to go to Europe, gets on a boat, sails over there, and arrives in England. There's a school there called the Braidwood School. So he goes in, and he sees students staring, trying to speech read and watch their teachers, and the teachers are up front talking and writing, and there's no sign. The kids are sort of struggling. And so, all right, he leaves, goes across the channel, and arrives in France. And in Paris, he goes into the deaf school, and he's in shock. It's amazing. He sees teachers who are deaf. He sees students writing and reading. This is amazing. Finally. It's perfect. So he goes, hey, I want some help setting up a way to teach deaf kids in America. But he doesn't speak French. They don't speak English. There's not much of a shared language. So the guy running the school is named Sicard. And he says, I can't help you. I'm running this school. This is my job. I live here. But we do have one teacher. He's young. He's new. Maybe he'll help you out. Hey, will you help me? So this man's name is Laurent Claire. This is his name sign. So Claire is young. He's deaf. He's recently married. Hey, do you want to come help me in the U.S.? Come on. Come with me to America. Come on. We need to learn how to teach deaf kids. Yeah, I don't know. I just recently got married. I have a job. Like, I'm busy here. The two of them have a couple of discussions. Finally convinces Claire to come with him. They get on the boat. And while they're on the boat, Claire is teaching him sign. And Gallaudet is teaching written English. They arrive back home. And so now what are they supposed to do? The first thing that they do is they set up the American School for the Deaf. It's the first deaf school in the U.S. It's 1870, and it's a place for deaf students to work. And it includes that big statue I've shown you here of Alice. That's that young lady. And her name is Alice. She's signing to Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. And the school is wildly successful. And they start by using LSF, but they've added in pieces of sign from the surrounding communities, especially from Martha's Vineyard, where there's a large deaf population, and some Native American signs as well from the local community. And it spins around and it becomes ASL. That's where that language is from. So all these papers that were written were about all these people who are genetically wrong. They're lesser than us. It's not appropriate to continue to let them struggle and suffer, right? So we need to prevent them from, having more children. If we need to convince them or if we need to maybe trick them, that's fine. So Graham Bell's writing was so well set up, so easy to understand, and so convincing for the public that you know who copied it to use it, right? The Nazis. Hitler and the SS. Oh, yeah. That's a good approach. And they used Bell's writing, so that's awful. So that paper became a big problem, and a lot of deaf people were very afraid that between A.G. Bell and the Conference of Milan, that they were afraid that sign language was just going to kind of die. So a little further in 1894, at Gallaudet, something else is happening, and it's very important for me and for Rory. But so, football, American football, right? The players will call out, oh, like blue 32, ready, right? It's a code that each team has developed. So it's great if you can hear, but if you're signing and anyone on the other team knows some sign, they can see your planned plays. So the deaf team decided to get into that circle, and they invented the football huddle. That's from Gallaudet. So a few years later, this very important other thing happens, and it changed the whole world, especially for deaf people. Video became accessible to the public. You could see something, you could record it, and you could keep it forever. So, a man by the name of George Veditz, he started a project, and he was filming deaf people who signed. And he called it the Preservation of Our Signed Language. And it started in 1913, went to about 1920. And for those 7 years, he filmed and filmed and filmed. And you can still see those videos. Let me show you. Okay, so that is how signed language literature becomes something that we can save and use. So 1924, they have a huge conference, and one of the things that comes up is international sign language. It's called Gestuno. It's the same concept as the spoken language Esperanto. It wasn't really very successful, but there are still people today who will ask, like, okay, why isn't there just one signed language for the entire world? Okay, well, why isn't there just one spoken language for the entire world? Because each individual country, group, region, tribe has developed their own language, right? Same for the deaf world. Some people use, for example, BSL. Some people use, for example, ASL. Some people use LSF. BSL is English British Sign Language, and it uses a two-handed alphabet. LSF uses the same alphabet as ASL, but the language is very, very different. It's the same as Ghanaian Sign, which has been impacted by ASL, but is a different language itself. So, a little bit later, and then we have what happened in the 1950s. So, there's the first meeting of the World Federation of the Deaf. And just a little side note here, you will sometimes see of the deaf and for the deaf. When it's for the deaf, it can mean other people have been trying to be helpful or supportive, but of the deaf means that it's run by deaf people. So they had the first meeting of that, and then there's a man named Andrew Foster. That's his name sign here. And he graduates from Gallaudet, which, okay, no big deal, right? He is the first black deaf man to graduate from Gallaudet. As soon as he graduated in 1954, he started immediately to set up deaf schools all over West Africa. Many different countries. He set up a whole bunch of them. And some of these countries were still struggling with recent civil wars. They were very newly independent, and he was setting up a space for deaf students to be safe and to learn. They stayed there, they lived there, they learned to sign. It was amazing. It's very important because they had a black man showing up to show them these signs and how to teach. And it didn't feel... So it felt a little less like missionary work. We have some pictures you can see. There's one on the board, but there's also the ones here. It shows students in Mampong, that's in Ghana, which is one of Andrew Foster's deaf schools. You see the people in the picture, right? There's the white lady with braids, and there's the tall brown guy. Those are Rory's parents. That's me and her dad. We flew there and we helped for 2 weeks to teach some of the teachers about how to better approach some deaf students. Okay, that was something like, 15 years ago. But you can see the pictures. So Andrew Foster, sadly, died in a plane crash while setting up these schools in about 1959. However, next there's this spectrum in like the 1960s to the 70s where there's a man named William Stokey. And Stokey was doing research and he was teaching about ASL linguistics for sign. Like, why does this happen? What are the rules for this language? What does it look like? We have them for English. We have them for other spoken languages. But he was the one who really set up a field of research about linguistics and got it printed for ASL. And because of that, you can see some amazing things happen. All right, so you know Broadway, where there's theater? So there was one play called Children of a Lesser God. And yeah, it's amazing. And it's about deaf people. And the woman who was acting in it was actually deaf, which was fantastic. And she won the Tony Award for her acting for the first time that a deaf person had won that award. And that's in 1980. After that, around the same time, 1970s-ish, there was a woman named Linda Bove. And she, also deaf, and she worked on Sesame Street. And she was teaching some sign on the TV show. And it was public broadcast, which means lots of children could see it and watch it and become interested in it. And it improved the way that deaf people were perceived. I'll explain a little bit more about this later, but in the 1970s, 1980s, 1974 specifically, there's this big change that happens, and it impacted the deaf world. All right, we'll make this short. So, in 1974, there was a law passed called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. It's now called IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it's complicated. So the goal was to prevent all of the students who were disabled, who used wheelchairs or who were blind or who had intellectual disabilities or anything else, from the continued treatment they were getting. A lot of them weren't allowed into, quote, normal public schools. So they were institutionalized and warehoused. They just kind of got put into places and left. They didn't really learn anything. They weren't really taught anything. It just meant they could stay there, quote, in these special schools. However, for deaf students, yes, deaf schools do have dorms and their parents do send them there. And they live there on campus for much of the year. But it means that Monday through Friday, these students have people they can communicate with. And that's important because, and it's not even just not most, it's 90% of the hearing parents of deaf students don't learn how to sign with their children. And so these kids struggle at home. They don't have clear communication, and it just kind of breaks down. So the school means that they have friends who can sign, they have teachers who can sign, they have staff who can sign. But because the other students were having such a hard time, that law was passed, and it said that it was very important for children with disabilities to spend as much time as possible in the least restrictive environment, the LRE, which means as much time as possible with their, quote, normal non-disabled peers. But for deaf students, it meant that it was still restrictive. They would struggle because they couldn't communicate with anyone because no one used the same language. So yes, it was a net positive, but it really didn't ease the struggle of deaf students. All right, so in 1986, two things happened. First, Gallaudet College became Gallaudet University, the first deaf university in the world. It is still the only deaf university in the world. Also, remember that play we were talking about, Children of a Lesser God? It became a movie, and the actress, who was deaf, won an Oscar for her acting. That's Marlee Matlin. Which is, wow, she was the first time that we have a deaf woman who won an Oscar. And so it was a continued positive for the deaf world. But some people... So, 1988. So, the college has become a university. Recently, that's great. So it's time to hire someone for the job of president of the university, right? Yeah, but they hired a hearing woman who didn't sign. The students refused. They protested. They showed up. We refused to go back to class. They marched, protested, big signs, deaf president now. And it felt like if we want someone to be leading us, that person should be one of us, right? So understand the man who became president next. Yes, he was deaf, but he wasn't born deaf. He was born hearing, and he talked. And then he got injured and became deaf. So maybe not as involved culturally, but still, the feeling is the connection is better because if you see someone signing and they see you signing, that connection is automatically there. So that was accepted. Then in 1996, in a country called Uganda, they elected their first parliament member who was deaf, which is amazing. And then 2009, again, these kept happening lots and lots of times. A little different, but here there's the first European parliamentarian who was deaf. Afterwards, in 2013. This one's a little silly, but it's the first time that there was a whole television episode that aired in ASL, and only ASL. I'm sure you've seen ones where they're all English, right? So there's English, or there's a little bit of writing, or there's English, and there's some sign, but this was the first time it was a fully ASL episode. It was a TV show called Switched at Birth. It was a really good show, if you want to watch. Okay, then, in 2015, all the way to 2016, Niall DeMarco happened. And he worked as a model, and he went on a show called America's Next Top Model. He went into the show, and he won. The next year, he went into, what's it called? Dancing with the Stars. Went into the show, and can he dance? Yeah, he can. And he won again. So this was huge for the deaf world. It was like, oh. So, one more short thing to add, really quickly. Between about 1999 and now, there are a lot of countries who have decided to recognize, so our country, our nation, has more than one natural language, more than one national language. For an example, Ghana has many different spoken languages, but they also have included GSL, Ghanaian Sign Language. Another example, Canada. So it has two spoken languages, right, that are nationally recognized, English and French. But they also have four languages altogether. There's English, French, ASL, and LSF. Well, LSQ, but Canadian French Sign, okay? And here we would have, I guess, English and ASL, but English isn't really an American language. See the name. But it would be added. People say, oh, this is America. You need to speak English, right? Do you mean like sign? Because that happened here. Do you mean like we're going to speak Navajo? Is that what you meant? Are these the languages we're going to include? These are American languages. Whatever. There's more and more countries who are recognizing that it's not only spoken languages that are. So Nile won both of these awards and improved a lot, and people were noticing like, wow, they're good. There's a lot of deaf representation in the world. That's an improvement. 2016, 12 lawyers applied for the U.S. Supreme Court bar to be able to try cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So all 12 of these are deaf lawyers, and they applied at the same time. And the Chief Justice, John Roberts, he learned just these signs. He said, your petition has been granted. He doesn't sign, but he learned those to show them the respect that they had earned, which is nice. In 2018, 2021, same kinds of things happened here. So you've seen the movie A Quiet Place, right? That won an Oscar and involved a deaf actress. And then the same idea sort of went for Coda, which was about a kid growing up with deaf parents. And it included many deaf actors. And it also won an Oscar. Nope, won 3 Oscars. And again, Marlee Matlin. So, we're almost caught up, right? 2 things I need to add really quick. 1, 2022, it was not really that year, but in that period during COVID. Do you remember the masks? Mumble, mumble, mumble. Mumble, mumble, mumble. Mumble, mumble, mumble. If you can't hear me, but you can understand me speak, that works maybe. But for kids who are deaf or hard of hearing who are trying to speech read, that was a struggle to get through COVID, because it meant that if you can speech read some, you're still struggling because you can't see anybody's face. A lot of people wouldn't write. There was nothing that was really working. The clear masks weren't really offered, and they get all fogged up too. So it's tough. So a lot of students who had been doing okay in mainstream schools up until that point and thought it was easy, now couldn't understand what their teachers were saying as they were trying to watch them. So it was really a lot harder. Secondly, now it's 2023, and what's happened? Well, more people understand that deafness isn't a bad thing, but it's included a little bit more. As an example, the Disney movies that we all grew up on. Now, if you add a Chrome extension, you can watch the Disney videos, and there's an interpreter in the box that automatically show up, and you can watch that. There's captioning too, but if you're struggling to read or you're young and you can't read yet, you're not reading fast enough for the captions, then you can watch the interpreter and you can participate in the movies too. And Disney owns Marvel as well. And they've decided also that they're going to start releasing their new movies with interpreters when they come out on streaming on Disney+. And that third piece is a Supreme Court decision that said students who are in school and face discrimination, where it destroys their education process, can sue now not only through IDEA, but that would force the school to change and ameliorate the discrimination. But they can also sue for money under the ADA to fix it. That means that you don't have to continue to pay for lawyers to win the first suit so that then you can take it to a second suit and it can just get fixed with some finances to fix the education problem. So now you understand why the pictures aren't really enough? How does deaf culture really function? Okay, so they do share a language. In America, it's ASL, and deaf people really value the use of that language. They also go through a lot of discrimination and have for a long time. You can label deaf people as not learning as the Greeks, go all the way to the Conference of Milan in the 1880s. There's Alexander Graham Bell as well, and he really wanted deaf people to kind of just disappear. Sign language got banned. And then the discrimination continues through no interpreters, through forcing kids into mainstream schools in the 1970s, which really had a negative impact on deaf schools. But also, children at deaf schools, up until the 1970s, grew up at the deaf school. Mom and dad would send them off Sunday night or Monday morning, and they would go and they would arrive at the school, stay in the dorms for the week until Friday night, Saturday morning, and then they would go back home. And it happened because there's only one deaf school usually in each state. I mean, California has two because there's so many people there, but most have one. In Oregon, ours is in Salem, which means if the kids' parents live in Portland, otherwise you're having to do that drive every time. And so it just doesn't happen that way. Washington is in Vancouver, which is just right over the river. But Oregon kids can't go there because the state line is a boundary. And so they've struggled with language acquisition and miscommunications, having communication just kind of break down because their parents don't have language access to communicate with them. Also remember that now deaf people have sued and been granted the rights for interpreters and for access to be able to see things improve with language and with interpreter access. And they share that as well. They also have values that are similar. One thing that deaf people value is bluntness, not where you're, a little bit this and that. You remember the man we were talking about, the French teacher who Gallaudet took, named Claire? His name sign, see this right here, is what it is because when he was 2, he was sitting in a high chair eating dinner and fell out of the chair. There was a fire in the house and he survived, but he had a scar across his face. So his name sign is, hey, it's that scar in the face. We're not talking negatively. It's just how we identify you easily. You see your friend and you're like, oh, I haven't seen you for 10 years. Wow, you've put on weight and your hair is great. Wow, I never thought I'd see you as an adult. That kind of bluntness can also mean that it can be a little bit difficult to integrate with hearing people sometimes. But the language, the struggles, the shared valued bluntness, those 3 things are part of the culture. There's also a few things that they really work together and seem to enjoy with. There's some jobs, there's many, many deaf people now who work for Amazon and for the post office because it tends to be a good job and there's a lot of deaf people and benefits. They also enjoy visual art. They enjoy poetry. that they create. They enjoy some music, yes. The hearing can be an issue, but you can feel the music, and there's more to it than that. On top of all of that, there's the feeling of needing to improve the world with access. And there's lots of deaf people who teach sign, and culturally that's who's supposed to learn. They value shared information. And they struggle against the problem with that when they're working together as a community. Because there are places where Gallaudet does that really well, where NTID does it really well. It's the college program at Rochester Institute of Technology for deaf specific students working in the tech world. So if you're in science, you can go there. If you're doing robotics, if you're doing math, if that's your focus, it's a perfect school for you. It's very, very popular. And what, quote, makes a culture? The other part that needs to be discussed is the idea of culture sharing and values sharing. So if you show up late in class, you do what? You sneak into the back and you hope that no one notices you, right? But in the deaf world, you show up and you're like, hey, sorry I'm late. There was a huge accident on the freeway. Traffic was terrible. I-5 right here, there was the accident. Why? Because it's not like you can listen to the radio to get that information. If this person explains it, that there was a crash, then everybody else knows not to use that route and they can go a different way. That shared information is extremely valuable. The honesty and the truth, it's just what you're looking for. But again, more than that, it's that deaf people value working together as a community. You'll see, oh, deaf of deaf means, oh, I'm deaf and my parents are deaf too. Or this is my CODA kid who's hearing but signs. People are excited about that. It's important because that's how the community continues on and builds a language that continues. Lastly, deaf people value what most in the world? Other deaf people. So people who are hearing from other countries and people who are deaf with other countries, people who are deaf have more in common than they do with people who are hearing from their own country. Here's an example. If you've got a room and this is a group of deaf people who use different sign languages, different alphabets, none of the same signs. And then you have a room of hearing people who have different languages, and you give them the same project to do. Who's going to get done first? It's the deaf group. Because every day they're used to figuring out gestures, how to explain, how to communicate with hearing people. And also because most sign languages also involve body language and facial expressions in order to communicate. And hearing people tend to just get louder and slower. So, deaf people really value other deaf people all over the world. If you're deaf with a disability, for example, like if you're deaf-blind, fine, we have an approach for that. That's great. We have hand under hand sign. If you're deaf and you, I don't know, for example, use a wheelchair, it's like, okay, we know how to do that too, how to make the communication simpler. I have one student who has a genetic difference, and that means that he doesn't have the same 10 fingers on each hand that the rest of us do. He still signs. It's just seen as an accent. No big deal. Another boy who's deaf with no legs, none of his peers are really upset by it. They don't bother him about it because deaf people value deafness. And people talk about my parents are also deaf or my grandparents are also deaf. This is my deaf kid. Those are impressive and important parts of the culture. If someone is deaf and an adult and they adopt deaf children, it's seen as an addition to the culture and everyone is thrilled and excited about it. That's an important part. And it shows that same idea. So if you say, oh, I'm deaf, and someone says, oh, I'm deaf, the connection's super quick. It's easy. That's why it's a culture, is because you grow up in it, and it means you make those connections with other deaf people really quickly. It doesn't matter where they're from. It can be the jobs that deaf people work. It can be the interests deaf people have. It can be the tendency to be blunt. Those are important parts of those connections. Welcome to Deaf Culture. All right, so you can see the pictures that are down there below, right? This first one is the picture from the American School for the Deaf that shows Gallaudet and Alice. The second one is Deaf President Now. And that's the big protest that happened in 1988. People who see it know where it's from. This was Deaf Power, and the sign that was used. It was really important. Thirdly, we have the picture of Children of a Lesser God, the winner during the Oscar ceremony. Many deaf people have opinions that differ about the movie itself or about the actress, but everyone knows who she is. So she's a symbol of the deaf community. And that last picture is of Ghana and Andrew Foster's Deaf School. And that one has me and some of the students. And you can see it's still open, it's still working. It's one of these approaches where we, as American deaf people, have a good relationship with other deaf people in the world. But pictures aren't really enough. So we need to talk about deaf people and music. So do deaf people enjoy music? Sure. I'm sure you've seen where the band is set up on a stage over here and the interpreter's over here. And
Hi, my name is what? My name is Sadie. Hi, my name is what? My name is Sadie. My name is what? Excuse me.
If you're connected to the music, really hearing people, oh wow, look at the interpreter. Sure. But deaf people are interested in watching. Why? Because some of them grew up hard of hearing, and so they really enjoy music growing up, and they still want access. Some really enjoy the feel of music, but they really want to know what the words are still too. Here's an example. You know the band Metallica? They recently decided that all of the songs in their new album are going to include interpreters. Which is great. Wow. But do deaf people play music? Yeah, they do. 2 examples. One is a band called Beethoven's Nightmare. and they're all deaf. The second one is Mandy Harvey.
Connective tissue disorder, so basically I got sick and my nerves deteriorated.
So, you were singing before you lost your hearing?
Yeah, I've been singing since I was 4. So I left music after I lost my hearing and then figured out how to get back into singing with muscle memory, using visual tuners, and trusting my pitch.
So your shoes are off because you're feeling the vibration. Is that how you're following the music?
Yeah, I'm feeling the tempo, the beat through the floor.
And Mandy, what are you going to sing?
I'm going to sing a song that I wrote called Try.
Okay, can you tell me what it's about?
After I lost my hearing, I gave up. But I want to do more with my life than just give up. So...
Okay, well, look, this is your moment, and good luck.
Okay. I don't feel the way I used to. The sky is gray, much more than it is blue. But I know one day I'll get through. And I'll take my place again. If I would try. If I would try. Oh, there is no one for me to blame. 'Cause I know the only thing in my way is me. I don't live the way I want to. That whole picture never came into view. But I'm tired of getting used to the day. So I will try. So I will try. If I would try. If I would try.
She was on, I think, America's Got Talent or something is the name of the show. And she's deaf herself, and she uses an interpreter, but she sings. Sometimes they'll make a music video that goes with another song, and hearing people enjoy that too. But remember, Beethoven himself was deaf. So most deaf people do enjoy music. But deaf people tend to use signed poetry and stories and handshake games more than music for... Okay, so the best improvements from society haven't really come from technology. A lot of people believe one of the biggest improvements for deaf people is cochlear implants and bone-anchored hearing aids, but most deaf people do not like those. It requires surgery, and it's forced on children usually before they are able to make a decision on their own, because the parents want the child to match with the hearing world. And the biggest change really has been using something called a TTY, where a deaf person would then connect to a hearing person with the telephone line in the middle, and they'd type. There'd be a beep that would go across, and then it would print out on the other side, and they could talk back and forth and back and forth. It had the same kind of LOL, BRB, SKSK, go ahead, whatever, that you do when you text. It was easier, but now you have two options. One is a caption phone, which means you can read and type and then that person can do it too. The hearing person can see it and go, oh, okay. They can hear what's being spoken, and then they can talk. It'll caption it and send it back over to you. It's automatic captions, though. They're not always perfect, but they're not bad. They're not terrible. For deaf people who don't sign, this is great. The second one is VRS. So again, deaf person's here, hearing person's here. In the middle, we have a live interpreter. I'll show you. So, you're calling hearing pizza place, okay? For example, like, you're calling Hot Lips Pizza here in Portland and you want to call and order. Okay. Hey, I'm curious if I can order pizza from you guys to deliver to the house. They can't see you because you're up on a screen and it's filming you. The interpreter sees you and then voices it for you. The hearing person hears it and says, yeah, we can take your order. What do you want? The interpreter hears that and then signs it where you can see it. Back and forth and back and forth. And if you're calling another deaf person, it just goes directly through. There's no need for the interpreter. But if the hearing place wants to call you, it still connects automatically through VRS. It's free for deaf people. If you're not deaf, you can't use one. But they had video calls, like FaceTime or whatever, way before those things existed. So it meant you had access to an interpreter, and the interpreter can translate the languages back and forth. And it makes communication a lot clearer. What's funny is if a deaf woman is calling and the interpreter is a man, then the hearing person is hearing a male voice. So there can be a little bit of confusion there sometimes.